People love to say that the 70s were the good old days. Peace, love, disco balls, and everyone having a good time. Yeah, not so much. If you actually lived through it, you know. It wasn't all glitter and groove. Sometimes it was just great. Hey everyone, I'm Felix. Welcome back to the channel. Now, I kind of came of age in the 70s. I was 10 in November of 1970. And, you know, I don't know that I remember it quite the way a lot of people will talk about it. It was the best. It was the greatest. It was the most wonderful time. There were some times that were really horrible. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, next time we're going to give credit where credit's due. We're going to talk about the best of the 70s. But this week, let's talk about gas shortages and having to sit in line to get gas so that by the time you got within view of the pumps, they were putting up the signs, sorry, no gas. Odd and even gas rationing based on your license plate. Who remembers that? Prices were going up through the roof. And everybody's paychecks were just sitting there. They called it, I think their catchphrase was stagflation, where everything was stagnating, except for prices. And then we had Gerald Ford doing his Whip Inflation Now initiative, which pretty much did nothing. Speaking of Gerald Ford, he's another part of the 70s that wasn't so great. We had Richard Nixon in the early 70s, and the Watergate scandal and his resignation, and then immediately upon Gerald Ford taking office, he pardoned Richard Nixon from everything that he did, and was probably the most ineffective president in my lifetime anyway, which is why he didn't get reelected. Have you ever known somebody that when they entered a room, you could smell them before they got there? That was the 70s. You could smell the 70s before they entered the room because our cities were covered in smog. Our rivers and streams were so heavily polluted that it ended up giving birth to shows like MacGyver, kid shows like Captain Planet. It was a mess. You could almost walk across the East River in New York without ever getting wet. The very concept of actually swimming in that river was basically committing suicide. The 1970s was when Saturday Night Live had the opening intro, live from New York, the most dangerous city in the world. And they weren't exaggerating. Crime throughout the United States was at all-time highs. Riots in Los Angeles. You couldn't walk through Harlem, Hunts Point, pretty much anywhere, Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn. You couldn't walk through there and consider yourself safe. I can't say much about hearing about or knowing about Chicago, but at the end of the 70s, I was in Chicago when I was in the Navy. And yeah, no, the place was like, I referred to it then as one big red light district. And the outskirts of Chicago were about 100 times worse, Waukegan, Illinois. So yeah, it was, the crime in the 70s was horrendous. I mean, we were giving birth to serial killers. Ted Bundy, Son of Sam. More than I could list. So yeah, in terms of crime, it wasn't so great. TV and movies were lying to us. You had all these happy families living on perfectly manicured lawns, on mini estates for all intents and purposes, while everybody else in the country was basically living on fumes and going broke. We had bought the house that we lived in, and that I grew up in Lindenhurst, And I'm here to tell you, it was no sitcom family life. My parents basically bought the cheapest house they could afford. We pretty much did whatever we had to do to keep the place livable. Everybody talks about the 70s as being free. Freedom. Free sex. That was the big thing through the 70s. But it came with a hangover. The drugs were getting much more powerful. The parties were getting much wilder. Studio 54. I actually went there once, and we'll talk about that in a future video. But there was decadence throughout. But the drugs were getting harder, the parties were getting wilder, and what was originally thought of as freedom by the end of the decade was exhaustion. Now, I'm not going to say that the music of the 70s wasn't incredible. It was. Personally, my favorite decade of music. But you could feel the corporations getting their grip on it. It was all about making money. And I mean, if you look now, today, you look at any of the commercials that are using licensed music, what are they using? They're using music from the 70s.
Ozempic.
And these people are still raking in the money from it. Basically, music stopped being rebellion and started becoming marketing. Hell, how else can you attribute the disco craze? The 60s promised change. The 70s delivered reality. The Watergate scandal, where everybody pretty much stopped trusting the government. And just everyone seemed a little tired of everything. I'll never forget sitting in those gas lines that were half a mile long with my parents, waiting for our turn to get gas. And then near the end of the decade, doing it myself in my own car. I remember saying something to somebody once that if gas ever gets above $1, I'm gonna give up driving. Well, I obviously didn't give up driving, but it got above $1. So yeah, the 70s weren't necessarily the good old days everybody remembers. They were messy, uncertain, and sometimes flat out ugly, but they made us resilient and ready for whatever came next. And what's coming next here is the upside of the 70s. I'm Felix, and that's the story of my life.
Well, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.